Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As we're letting the last set of people filter in, I just want to say welcome to another episode of Paleo Perks, or another edition of Paleo Perks. Today's speaker is Anne-Claire Fabre, and she's currently at the University of Zurich. And today she'll be presenting a talk titled How in vivo data on extant species can shed light on paleoecology of extinct species. For those of you who haven't been to a Paleo Perk seminar before, the format of today's seminar is that we're just going to do a brief couple minutes of welcome and announcements. We'll have a 30-minute talk followed by a moderated question and answer period. And then afterwards, we invite all of you to stick around for an after talk tea time with Anne-Claire, who's agreed to stick around to chat about science, about her talk, about her path through science and research. And so we really encourage you to stick around for that as well. And we'd like to remind folks that the way that our moderated Q&A works is that we will be sending or fielding questions through the chat to Kate, who is our questions at Paleo Perks host for today. So just a couple of bits of housekeeping. We here at Paleo Perks really value the participation of all folks who are interested in paleo sciences, and we do have a code of conduct for today's seminar that we'd like to remind you to that you did agree to. If you somehow managed to land in this seminar without agreeing to our code of conduct, please take a moment to navigate to our website and read through that and sign up for the mailing list. We ask that you please mute yourselves for the duration of the talk, and that you can ask any questions by chatting to the questions at Paleo Perks host. If you have any technical issues, you can go to the questions host as well. Just a couple of other little bits of housekeeping. We're now accepting nominations for our potential speaker pool. So if you are an excellent early career researcher who would like to present your work, or you know an excellent early career researcher who you think would give a great talk, please head over to our website and fill out a nomination form. We also are now using Zoom's integrated closed captioning, which some of you may be seeing on the screen below you. You can toggle that on and off for yourself by using the CC button at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom controls. And then finally, in the chat window, there's going to be a Survey Monkey for this week's attendance. So if you're willing to fill that out and just let us know who you are, what you're thinking about, we really appreciate those. They're anonymous and optional, but it helps us to know who's actually coming to these things. All right, so that's a lot of rambling. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Anne-Claire Fabre. And Anne-Claire has been doing research in a lot of different places. And she really, I think, something that stood out to me when I was putting together her bio is just how diverse her background and her training has been, from doing her biology and geology degrees as a bachelor's student all the way through her PhD in France and then in the UK. She's also worked in the US at Duke, in Paris, in the Natural History Museum in London, and she actually just recently started a postdoc position in the University of Zurich. And so she's really been all over the world with her science. And I'm really excited to hear what she's been working on. And she's going to share some really cool vertebrate paleontology with us today. So without me talking much more, I'd like to have Anne-Claire take over the screen share and we'll get going.
So can you see the pangolin right now?
Yes, we can definitely see your pangolin.
Great. So thanks a lot for the introduction and for the invitation to give a talk today. So today I will talk about how in vivo data on extant species can shed light on the paleoecology of extinct species. So I will try to convince you about how important it is to try to get, when possible, data on living species to understand and reconstruct the paleobiology of extinct species. So a major goal in my research is really to understand the origin and evolution of phenotypic diversity. But understanding variation is complex, as there is many factors that can influence it. For example, environmental constraint can impact the morphological evolution, as you can see on this slide, with, for example, aquatic fossorial aerial and arboreal adaptation, where non-related species evolve similar morphologies under similar environmental constraints. So there is several internal and external factors that can influence morphological diversity. Nevertheless, the current diversity is just a teeny tiny part of the past diversity. And to understand this current diversity and the processes shaping it, it is essential to study the fossil record in time and space in relation to environmental and spatial changes. These are really the core of my research. To study the past and understand the evolution of morphological diversity, as you may all know, because I know that I'm talking to a public of paleontologists, fossils are the only evidence of extinct species. And to interpret the biology of fossils, it is really important to understand the ecology and behavior in relation to the morphology of living species, when it is possible, obviously. This is the method of phylogenetic bracket, and I think that now it's kind of well used in paleontology for years and years. However, the interpretation of shape differences are limited because there is a lack of data on the interplay between bone and muscle in relation to function. So it is kind of surprising, but nearly all the hypotheses that we are using in functional morphology were never quantitatively tested. For example, we have no idea about the covariation between the muscle and the bone. It's said in the literature that a powerful muscle will be related, for example, with big crest of area of insertion of this muscle on a bone. But we have no idea. And the external forces, so the forces that are exchanged between the animal and the environment during locomotion are shaping the skeletal, the shape of the bone. We have no idea about it too. So most of the studies in functional morphology are mainly looking at the shape evolution of the bone or some myology evolution, performance, and behavior separately, taking into account the phylogeny. I'm also doing that because it's a way quicker to look at everything separately. But the originality of my research is also to look at the relationship between all of them. So I'm mainly doing integrative approaches, looking at the relationship between bone, muscles, performance, and behavior. More specifically, I'm interested by the evolution of bone morphology using morphometrics, such as linear measurement or geometric morphometrics. It's just totally depending on the research question that I had in mind and what is the easiest to use. Then I'm looking at muscle properties by doing traditional and virtual dissection. With this dissection, you can obtain good proxies for space requirements and force of muscles. So it's also really complementary from the bone. It's another kind of information that you can get. I'm also looking at performance. So if you have no idea of what is a performance, it's based on a paper of Arnold, and it's defined as the ability of an organism to execute a function that is pertinent in its ecological context. And it's, for example, some quantitative data on locomotion, gripping force, or bite force. Here you've got a ringtail that is working on an horizontal pole. So it's the arboreal locomotion that is mimics here. You can see here the force plate, and when the animal is eating the force plate while walking, you are recording forces in 3 dimensions, and you can get the maximum forces that are a representation of part of its locomotion. Here you've got some animals that are gripping transversally a pole or horizontally, and here you've got a primate that is biting a bite force transducer. So this can be a really good proxy for locomotion or any kind of interesting trait. And finally, I'm also doing quantification of behavior, such as locomotion or grasping behavior. Here, this is just an illustration of the prehensile behavior used during the food acquisition, such as if the animal is using the mouse, one hand, the mouse and one hand, and so on. So I will talk just right after a little bit more about that. So for this presentation, I will present two case studies that I did the past year. So the first one is about the evolution of prehensile behavior and forelimb morphology in strepsirrhines. So it's really linking behavioral analysis to shape analysis. So why studying manual grasping? So grasping with the hand is something that is really widespread among tetrapods. As you can see on this slide, so frogs, lizards, and a bunch of different kinds of mammals are grasping with the forelimb. And there is different kind of hypotheses concerning the origin and evolution of this behavior. Here, I will just present the main two hypotheses. So the first one is that the grasping ability may have derived from arboreal locomotion, as when a species need to move in the tree, it needs to grasp the branch, otherwise it will fall. And the second main hypothesis is the capture of mobile prey. So if you are moving in the tree or even in a terrestrial environment, and there is a prey that is moving, you can catch it way faster if you are using your phone. So both of these hypotheses and all the other hypotheses that I'm not presenting here are not mutually exclusive. For this first example, I will present the aim, which is to quantify the relationship between grasping behavior and the shape of the long bone of the forelimb in order to better understand the origin and evolution of grasping behavior and to be able to reconstruct the paleobiology of extinct species. So here, the sample that I'm using is living strepsirrhines. So for those that I have no idea of who are the living strepsirrhines, they are primates. So they are mainly primates from Madagascar, with some few exceptions that are living in Africa or in Asia, such as, for example, the loris and the Nycticebus or the bush babies. All those other ones, so the most famous one, I think, is the ringtail that you may see really often in the zoo, or the ruffed lemur that you can see here. The Chifaka is pretty well known too, the bamboo lemur, and all the other guys are all called brown lemur. And this dataset is composed of over 20 species with a great diversity of behavior. And I was making my acquisition of data at the Parc Zoologique de Paris, at the zoo in Antwerp, in Belgium, and at the Duke Lemur Center. So most of the data are coming from the Duke Lemur Center. If you have the occasion at one point to go to visit the Duke Lemur Center, it's an amazing research facility. So it's one of the best places to work in the world if you want to work on primates, I think. So it's the second Madagascar, basically. So what were we doing? So this part was done in collaboration with one of my students, Louis Peck, and we were looking at the quantification of the prehensile behavior, so during food acquisition of static food items. So we did that for over 100 of individuals belonging to 23 species, and we decided to define 5 grip types. So if the animal is catching the food with a mouth, one hand, 2 hands, the mouth and one hand, the mouth and 2 hands. On the other side, we were quantifying the shape of the long bone of the forelimb using geometric morphometrics. So for the humerus, the ulna, and the radius, and you can see here the different kind of landmark that I was taking, with in red what we call the true landmark, in blue the sliding semi-landmark of curves, and in green the sliding semi-landmark of surface. And what we were doing, so in one side we were getting the shape of the long bone of the forelimb. On the other side, we were getting the behavioral data on grasping behavior. So we were then looking at the covariation between the shape of each long bone and the grasping behavior using a method that is called phylogenetic two-block partial least square. What can we see here? So these are a summary of the results. And you can see here that there is a significant covariation between grasping behavior and the humeral and the radial shape, but not with the ulna. Here is the scatter plot of the two-block partial least square. And what I like with this kind of study is that this is really visual. You can really see the results. And just here are the results for the radius, but the results for the humerus are nearly looking the same. So I will just present the result for the radius. And what you can see here on the negative side is slender loris. And on the positive side, you've got a Chirogaleus. And what is nice with this kind of analysis is that you can get back to the shape and see how it's covering with the behavior. And so here in blue are represented the radius of the slender loris in relation to the fact that this is mainly catching the food with one hand. On the other side, so you've got the Chirogaleus, the Ai, the rough lemur, and so on, which have a radius which is way more robust, and in relation with the fact that they are mainly catching the food with their mouth and they are using a little bit different kind of strategies. What is interesting here is that the main long bones that are covering with the grasping behavior are the long bones that are in relation with the supination and pronation, so with the movement of rotation of the forearm, the wrist, and the hand. So something that is really important when you want to grasp something. So what can we say here is that we've got a strong covariation between the humerus and the radial shape and the prehensile behavior, meaning that because we've got the shape, we can try to infer this behavior. And it's what we will try to do in the future with one of my collaborators, Judith Marigot. So we've got a lot of humerus and radius of Adapis, Plesiadapis, and other kind of early primates. And we want to try to infer that, but it's still ongoing study because taking behavioral data and working with extant animal to get really in vivo data is taking time, and it's year on year of acquisition of data. So since 2010, I started to build these data sets, and I suppose and I hope that at one point I will be able to publish the final result. But I prefer to have as much as possible species for this case. And currently, we've got over 100 species of primates for the shape data of the forelimb, and we've got over 40 species for the behavioral data. I'm also acquiring data on other group of mammals, such as carnivorans, rodentia, and marsupiala. So yeah, stay tuned, and in the future you will see the result of this study. And so far it's what we did. So it's just the shape of the humerus here, and what you can see here, the stars are representing the fossils, and the other thing are the living species. And what you can see here that is interesting is that the fossils are falling in the morphospace of the extant species, which is kind of cool. So the next step will be to infer the locomotion, because we also get data on locomotion, and the grasping behavior of this guy. And the other stuff that is fun is that Lucy is falling really close, so from Homo sapiens, but also from the loris. So you've got the shape of the humerus of human is really similar to the slender loris. So it was already shown by Cartmill and collaborator in previous studies. So let's move on to the second part of this talk, which is the second study case, where in this part, I'm inferring the bite force and the paleo diet in giant extinct strepsirrhines. So I don't know if you know the giant lemurs. So over 2,000 years ago, Madagascar was occupied by giant lemurs, and they disappeared due to human colonization and to human activities such as hunting and other habitat destruction, and it leads them to extinction, basically. So for this study, we were looking at the bite force. Why the bite force? Because it's an ecologically important trait, and it is also a really good proxy for diet. So again, we were using the phylogenetic bracketing, using as extant reference the living strepsirrhines, the extant strepsirrhines. They display a great variation of diet, with some species that are frugivores, such as this lemur, other ones that are insectivores, such as this slender loris, other ones that are folivorous, such as this bamboo lemur, and other ones that are just weird, such as this aye. So for those that have no idea of what is an aye, it's a primate, even if when you are looking at it morphologically, you have the feeling that this is a kind of chimera, a mix between a rodent and a primate. So it's got this ever-growing incisor and this really thin and elongated third finger in the hand. And it's using this really thin and elongated third finger to tap on the wood. And when it's able to locating a grub, it will just start to gnaw the bark with the ever-growing incisor. And when it makes a hole, it will just go and get the grub with a really thin and elongated third finger, which have a claw at the end. So yeah, it's a really weird guy, and we'll come back on it later. So for this study, the first thing that I was wondering is what is the link between bite force and masticatory bone shape? So what we were doing in collaboration with Anthony Herrell and Dave Brower and the entire staff of the Duke Lemur Center, we were recording the bite force at the molar and the incisive site using this bite force transducer. So we did that for over 20 species of strepsirrhines. On the other side, we were quantifying the shape of the mandible and the cranium in collaboration with Maite Nadumont. So the mandible is kind of easy because it has only one function, and which is biting. And here you can see the protocol of landmarking that I was using to accurately depict the shape and the insertion of the muscle in the mandibular shape. On the other side, you can see the protocol that we were using for the cranium. And it's a little bit more complex for the cranium because it got multiple functions, from biting to the protection of the brain and sensory organ, breathing, drinking, and so on. And you can see the protocol over there. So we were looking at the covariation between the shape of the cranium and the bite force. And we were really surprised that we didn't find any kind of covariation between the bite force and the cranial shape. So we were wondering, what about the mandibular shape and the bite force? And yeah, this time we find a really nice covariation. And what you can see here, so on the negative side of the scatter plot, you got the aye and the shifaka, which have a mandibular shape which is really robust with a really short body and a really big ramus for the insertion of the muscle in relation with a really strong bite force. On the other side, you've got mainly all the brown lemurs that are mainly frugivorous with a really more gracile mandible in relation with a low bite force. Then we were wondering, what about the relation between the muscle and the masticatory bone shape? So here it's just a little caution for the people that are afraid of dissection or things like that. So the next slide will be 2 pictures of dissection. So if you don't like to see dead animal, you can just not have a look at your screen. I will tell you when I'm done with this slide. So I'm moving on to the next slide. Close your eyes if you don't want to see it. So this is a dissection on aye. And we were doing the dissection for over the same 20 species in collaboration with Jonathan Perry and collaborators. And what we were getting from that, so we were getting the volume of the muscle, which are a good proxy for the space requirements. And we were getting the physiological cross-sectional area, which is called the PCSA, which is a really good proxy for the force. So I changed the slide. You can open your eyes if you want. There will be no more picture of dead animal. So sorry about that. So concerning the covariation this time between the muscle and the shape of the cranium, there is a really nice covariation with, on the negative side, so still the aye and the shifakas, which are represented by the shape in blue. And when you look at it, So they've got a snout which is pretty short, and they've got a zygomatic bar that is pretty wide. And this is in relation with really strong muscle, and especially with a really strong big masseter, zygomatico-mandibularis, and temporalis spatio-adenomatica. On the other side, you've got mainly some bush babies and mouse lemur in relation with a cranial shape that is looking like that, with a snout that is more elongated and thin, and a zygomatic bar that is really gracile, and which is associated with muscles that don't have a big volume and don't have a big PCSA. So here I'm only showing the result for the volume, but just that you know the result for the PCSA, we are looking exactly the same. And you can have a look at it in this paper if you are interested. What about the covariation between the mandibular shape and the muscles? We didn't find any covariation. So neither with the volume or the PCSA, there was no covariation between the shape of the mandible and the muscles. What can we say from that, from the result on extant species? We can say for the mandible that there is a strong covariation between the mandibular shape and the bite force, and that the mandible shape is a good predictor of bite force. So good bone to use in primate if you want to predict the bite force and if you want to look at the diet. And it's maybe due to the fact that the mandible has a single function and its shape evolved to bite force constraints. What about the cranium? So there is a strong covariation between cranial shape and muscle. There is no covariation between cranial shape and bite force. So don't use the cranium if you want to infer bite force. And the cranial shape seems to have evolved due to architectural constraints related to the insertion of muscle, but it seems that there is a trade-off between these different functions, so it's a little bit more complex. So now that we know that, we know that we can use the shape of the mandible to infer the bite force of the extinct giant lemurs. So it's what we did. And we were looking at 3 enigmatic species. So 2 baboon lemur or monkey lemur. The first one is Hadropithecus tegnognattus, and the other one is Archaeolemur edwardsi, and a koala lemur that is called Megaladapis edwardsi. When you look at the fossils, so you can see that it's just a dream for paleontologists, but yeah, I know there are some fossils, but they are really well preserved. And concerning the previous studies that were done, so one study performed by Betsy Dumont and collaborator were doing some biomechanical study to reconstruct the bite force and the paleo diet of both of the monkey lemur. And what did they find? So they found that Hadropithecus tegnognattus was able to generate higher bite force with a small gape, allowing it to eat small but tough items, such as a folivorous species, whereas Archaeolemur edwardsi was able to eat bigger food items at larger gape, but with slightly lower bite force. Another study was done by Laurie Godfrey and collaborator, where they were looking at the stable isotope of the carbon, and they were reconstructing the paleo diet of this species. And for Hadropithecus tegnognattus, they found that it was mainly eating C4 and cane plants, so which correspond to leaves, so again, folivorous species. And for Archaeolemur edwardsi, they found that it was eating mainly C3 plants, which correspond to a vegetable fruit with big seeds, so it was more frugivorous species. What about the koala lemur, Megaladapis edwardsi? So there was 2 studies that were done, and they were looking mainly at the symphysis between the 2 mandibles. So it's the part where the mandibles are attaching. And they show that it was able to generate a modest bite force in comparison to the other archaeolemurids that you have seen before, and it was probably folivorous. So the first thing that I did is just to plot my data. So I was plotting the jaw shape for the different kind of extant species to start. And what you can see here is that there is a really nice clustering of the species depending on the diet, with in red the folivorous species, in yellow the omnivorous species, and in gray the frugivorous species, and over there the weirdo, which is the AI. So I was stating for the shape difference depending on diet, and using a phylogenetic maneuver, and there was a shape difference of the mandible depending on the diet. So the next step was to add the fossils inside this morphospace. And where do you add them? So here are both of the monkey lemur, and you can see that they are falling in the morphospace of the folivorous species, and more precisely in the morphospace of the indrids, so the Shiphaka families. This result is kind of making sense because previous studies that were done on molecular data were showing that both of these monkey lemurs were belonging to the indrid family. Then for the koala lemur, you can see that this is falling here in between the sported lemurs that are the lepilemurid, the indridae, and the bamboo lemur. So all of them are folivorous. So all our extinct specimens are falling, it seems, in the morphospace of the folivorous species, but don't forget that we are only looking at the first two PC of the principal component analysis here. Then, what we were doing, so because we know this variation between the bite force and the mandibular shape, we were using this covariation to infer the bite force at the molar and the incisive sites. So what we found here is that we found for Hadropithecus stegodactus that the molar bite force, so for an animal that is about 32 kilograms, the molar bite force is nearly 240 newtons, and the incisive bite force is around 116 newtons. So you divide it by 10 and you will obtain the number in kilogram for the forces. This seems to correspond kind of well to a folivorous species. When you look at Archaeolemur edwardsi, which is a species which is about 26 kilograms, you can see that the molar bite force is around 210 newtons, and the incisive bite force is around 120 newtons. Yeah, it can be folivorous, frugivorous too. When you look at the Megaladapis edwardsi, you can see it's a pretty heavy animal, around 88 kilograms, and the molar and incisive bite force is way lower than the other one. So it will be kind of weird that this one is folivorous or is eating really tough stuff. Concerning these two guys, the values that we are obtaining are half of the values that were predicted by the study of Betty Dumont collaborator. Why? So there is two solutions for that. The first one is that in the model that they were using, they didn't have any in vivo data. So then the prediction that you obtain can be just totally wrong because you have no idea of what is really happening in real life. The other thing that can be is that when you are doing geometric morphometrics, you get rid of the size, and size does really matter, especially for biting, because bigger you are, harder you bite. So what I was doing next is re-adding the size in the shape to see if this is changing something. When I add it, it's getting even worse. So here, I really hope that I convince you that sometimes, or really often, it can be really useful to have real in vivo data on extant species when it is possible, and to try to spend time to acquire more data to better understand what is really happening and to have better analysis in functional morphology. So to finish the acknowledgement, so first of all, I really want to thank the organizing committee for the invitation. Then I really want to warmly thank the entire staff of the Duke Lumiere Center. Without them, this study would not have been possible. All the collections that were providing the material that I was using, my collaborators that were giving feedback and helping for some data, and all the grants that allow me to do this study. And finally, I really want to thank the collaborator. Without them, this study would not have been possible. So if you have any question, I will be more than happy to try to reply to them. So thank you for listening.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that really interesting talk, Anne-Claire. I just want to take a moment to remind folks who are listening in to please send your questions to the Perks questions host. That's Kate this week. And to get us going, just two quick thoughts. One of them is, wow, that II is very weird in like all of your plots, and that was very cool. But then I guess the just sort of a quick question is that I personally am intrigued by the way you've been trying to link morphology to specific behaviors. So like the feeding behavior thing you talked about at the beginning. And I was wondering whether you have a sense of what other behaviors beyond feeding or sort of which hand one would use might you want to look for in a future study?
So the other kind of behaviors that are really interesting to look at, and there is another researcher that is currently doing that, is the locomotion and the way that the animal are grasping the branch during locomotion, for example. And it's Séverine Toussaint that is currently doing that in Berlin with John Miyacatura and Dionysos Koulatos. And she already published a first part on it that was last year in Current Biology. And I'm really looking forward to see the next result that she will get, because I think it will be really interesting to link that to what I already did. Otherwise, for the forelimb, I think locomotion is one of the most important driver, and even for the grasping behavior.
Excellent. So we just got a question in that asks how much intraspecific variation is present in the bite force and muscle mass? And so I'm just going to pop that into the chat as well.
So for the bite force, the most of the variation that you get is with ontogeny. So the younger are biting not so hard, and the older too. Then for most of the species, you've got sexual dimorphisms too. So depending on who is the dominant, it can be the male or the female. But yeah, there is in adults there is a teeny tiny difference. Then there is a difference depending on sex when there is a dominant species. And in strepsirrhine, it's the female that are dominant.
So you're looking at something that's more intraspecific than interspecific in a sense?
So I try to get as much as possible data for the intraspecific, but I'm looking at both honestly. And the thing is that to get a really big sample or big intraspecific sample for mammals, it's kind of complicated because you will end up just to go maybe all around the world, and maybe at the end of your career you will have a nice data set. It's a way easier if you are working I don't know, but in amphibians or in lizards, snakes. Snakes can be a little bit tricky to get. So I would not say snakes, but lizards definitely, it's kind of easy to get this kind of data. But mammals, yeah. So either you need to go everywhere around the world in the zoo, and you will end up with a nice intraspecific data set with 30 individuals. But if you are going in the field with mammals, I'm afraid that it will nearly never happen. So maybe with rodents, but I'm even not sure.
Fair enough. Just a quick follow-up for that. In your analyses, do you then use the mean value per species or include each individual separately?
I'm using a mean value. So what is happening for the bite force? I'm using the maximum bite force. So it's what we call the performance is really the maximum that you can get for the forces. and then I'm making a mean of the maximum of all the individuals. Because we do not make them bite only once when we are recording the biting. We make them bite several times to be sure that we are getting consistent values.
Great. She says, thank you. So just a slightly related question is, how do the reconstructed bite forces you presented at the end of your talk compare to other primates or other mammals that we might be more familiar with, like maybe humans or something else, for some of us who don't know, who don't think in kilonewtons of jaw force?
So talking about that, so there is not so many data about bite force that are already published in the literature. So there is a lot of reconstruction of bite force. And when you compare it with the data set, you realize that most of the time the bite force are not correctly estimated. So the thing is that for the primates, if you compare them with data that we have with Anthony Herrell and other collaborators on carnivorans, they are not really exceptional, except for the II. The II is just unbelievable because it's biting way harder at the incisive sites than on the molar, and the molar site it's nearly not biting, and we do not know an animal that is doing that. It's just incredible, and even for the rodent, it's not working the same. So we are really wondering what is going on with the II.
Right, that IA just comes up as the weird one every time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we've got another question. It says, it does make sense that cranial shape and bite force wouldn't be necessarily correlated because, as you said, the skull shape has multiple functions. But then why do you think there's no correlation between the lower jaw shape and mandibular muscles, given that the bite force is generated by the muscles themselves?
So I was waiting for this one, and this one is a little bit more trickier than what I was explaining. So can you see this slide?
Yes.
So the thing is, what is nice with the two-block partial square is working a little bit. It's a mix, I would say, between a regression and a principal component analysis, meaning that you've got several layers, several axes of covariation. And when you look at other axes, so for example, here is the third axis, and you can see that it's nearly significant, the covariation. And for nearly each scatter plot, when you look at them, you've got something that is going on that is really weird. So you've got the II in one side, and in the other side, you've got the bambou lemur and both of the Shifacas. And these guys have a really strong mandible with in relation with really strong bite force, but that are doing really different kind of stuff. So I think what we are getting here is that there is different kind of shape that can act with strong muscle. So you've got a kind of many-to-one mapping that is happening with the mandible, where you can have a big volume of muscle and other kind of thing, but that are going on differently. And here you can see the minimum where the II have got a ramus that is pretty weird in relation with volume and PCSA of certain kind of muscle, whereas for the Shifaka and the bambou lemur, you've got a really big and thin coronoid process, and the way that the articulation is made also with the cranium is not the same at all than the II, as you can see here. And you've got the shape, the muscle there that are different. So the muscles that are really strong for this guy are different kind of set of muscle. So you've got different way where you can bite hard, have strong muscle, and have different kind of mandibular shape. So I think the signal that we've got. And
right,
even
so
when you remove the II, no, I would not say that. So I do not remember the result for that. I need to check.
Fair enough.
if different or not. But yeah.
Fair enough. Lots of different pieces. Just to change tact a little bit entirely. We have a question in that says it's very interesting how human-like or monkey-like the extinct lemur face is compared with the others, with round skull and large eye sockets. And do you have any thoughts about how that evolved? And I just popped that.
Can you say it again? Sorry.
Yeah, so I said it's very interesting how human-like or monkey-like the extinct lemur, I can't get its genus right, in its faces compared to the others, with a round skull and large eye sockets. And are there any ideas why this evolved?
No idea, but what is fun is that so if I'm heading back to the slide in question there, what is fun is back in the days there was some study that was really wondering if they were closely related to human or not. So because they have their skull shape that is really robust morphology, and they were really thinking that they were associated to hominids family. But no idea why they've got this really special shape. There is still a lot to do on this species, honestly. But that's true that they are really human-like.
Excellent. So I just have two quick more questions, and if anyone else has a question they'd like to send in, we'll get to that one as well. So there was one that just came in, which we'll add to the queue. So just a quick question. Do you think that different ways of estimating bite force might affect the results that you're getting, like using finite element analysis or estimates from body size rather than the specific measurement tool that you use, or even a different measurement tool maybe?
So for finite element analysis, one of the main problems is that a lot of people are using them without having in vivo data. And it's one of the requirements when you are doing finite element analysis. Otherwise, you are just looking at difference of topology of shape. So it's one of the things that, you can do finite element analysis, but without in vivo data, you will not get accurate results.
Fair. Excellent. And then also, how far along a lineage do you think that this type of data could be extrapolated? For example, do you think that these findings would be an example, for example, applicable in other mammals? Another question.
I would not say to all mammals. So if I don't know, I would say that it would be better to use the most closely related group on which your fossil is belonging. But if there is nothing else, it's still better than nothing. And at least you can try to get a wider sample and see if you are still getting a kind of linear relationship between part of shape or shape and the bite force, something like that. Yeah, I would be surprised that if you are using this kind of data with artiodactyl or any kind of set artiodactyl, you may find the same. It's tricky to say, but the thing is that there is not so many data right now, or at least that are published. And we do the best with what we can, and that's it. So then I'm not complaining about people that are just working on shape or something like that. I'm also doing it because it's so time consuming to acquire this kind of data sets that I'm not expecting that everybody will do it. But if more and more people can try to do it, I think it will be nice, because then we can really better understand what is happening and have a really robust hypothesis in functional morphology.
Yeah. I definitely understand the need for more extant data. So our final question for today is the one that just came in the chat a minute ago. It says, the studies you presented us were performed on extinct species that have close living relatives. To what extent could we infer comparable performance for an extinct taxon with no close living relative by applying your approach to a roughly convergently similar extant taxon? for example,
Yeah,
going
I
to
think
opposites.
yeah, it's the best way will be to try to have a bunch of species that are really convergent and try to see what is happening. And then sometimes it's just not possible, and you do what you can do with that, and that's it. So yeah.
Sure. All right, so I think that is it for questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to snag the screen share back from you to do our little outro. But we really, really encourage everyone to stick around and chat a little bit more with Anne-Claire about all of her really interesting work with lemurs. So we'd like to just say thank you to everyone for sticking around for Paleo Perks this week. We'll pop that Survey Monkey for attendance back in the chat again. So if you didn't fill it out, we'd like to have you do that. We'd like to invite you to join us next week for when Hazel Richards at Monash University in Australia presents peculiar Pelorchestes. I got that wrong, sorry. Exploring forelimbs and form and function in a lost Australian giant. And we'd like to note in particular that Hazel is in Australia. And so our seminar next week is going to be live at 5 hours later than its usual time at 2100 UTC. And it will, of course, be recorded, but those of you who are on the west coast of the US maybe will find this a little bit better of a time, and we're sorry for our European colleagues, but the fun of an international seminar series. So up next, we'll have a lovely tea time with Anne-Claire, and we really encourage you to stick around to chat and learn more about the career path, the work that's going on, maybe make some new friends or have an interesting chat before you head off to your regularly scheduled day. We will have a little 2-minute break before tea time starts to give everyone a chance to get up, grab some water, or maybe even some actual tea. And just as fun, if you have paleo pets, we encourage them as well. So I'm just going to hit this timer and we'll pop back in about 2 minutes. And thank you again so much, Anne-Claire, for your wonderful talk.
You're welcome.